listening to Let's Talk Sustainable Business.
Welcome to Let's Talk Sustainable Business, a podcast hosted by the Conference Board's Global Sustainability Center. I'm your host, Claudia Lee. This is part 2 of my conversation with Ruth Andrade, Earth Care Strategy Lead at LUSH Cosmetics UK. In our last episode, Ruth gave us a summary of what her role as Earth Care Strategy Lead involves, LUSH's regenerative business model. She also offered practical advice for businesses transitioning to a more regenerative value chain. In part 2, Ruth will be sharing a few case studies to show us what a regenerative supply chain really looks like. Hi, Ruth. Welcome back to Let's Talk Sustainable Business. I know you have a few case studies that you wanted to share with us, so I will let you talk about it. And I'm excited to hear all about some of the case studies you have to share.
Sure. I think one of them goes back to what I said before about doing some really high integrity projects where you're trying to bring a lot of principles together and then learn from those. And I think one of the ones that I think we've layered in so much positive impact, is a project that we have in Sumatra. So we use quite a lot of patchouli essential oil, and Indonesia and Sumatra is where a lot of that patchouli oil traditionally comes from. And to originally, farmers, in order to collect patchouli and cultivate patchouli, would enter the forest and even do some logging, illegal logging in the forest, as well as slash and burn practices seasonally, for example, that would cause sometimes forest fires to spread into the national park. So again, as I mentioned, we like to fund with groups that are already doing permaculture, and we partnered with an amazing permaculturist called Saba, and we funded the establishment of the Gaio Lewis Permaculture Center in 2015. So we actually funded, instead of starting working with farmers, we started building the capacity of the local area to be working with farmers, right? So we funded first the permaculture center, and we strategically chose a 10-hectare site that was adjacent to the Gunung Luser National Park. So that idea of really working on the buffer zones of important habitats is really key to stopping a lot of deforestation and forest degradation at the moment. And that we have primary forest. So the vision was to use that demonstration site to show how patchouli could be grown on land outside the national park without having to fell trees or have an impact on wildlife. So through the center, we trained 150 farmers from 6 villages on how to avoid slash and burn and how to do like patchouli seedling cultivation, soil management, composting. How do you do integrated pest management without the use of pesticides? How do you do the processing post harvest? And then we also help to set up the distillation equipment, because something that's important for Lush is that the value adding stays in the local area as much as possible. And instead of buying the raw materials, we actually buy the high value essential oil. So we also supported the installation of a distillation equipment using hydroelectric energy. So it's like a carbon neutral distillation equipment rather than using wood from the forest, because a lot of distillation is powered by wood, and that wood again often comes from deforestation. We also supported the permaculture center to reforest 50 hectares in Gaio, which had been destroyed by patchouli cultivation. And because then again you're supporting the local development and the local capacity, then they even got to the point where village regulations on the purchase of patchouli oil started encouraging farmers to protect natural resources, and actually banned illegal logging, banned encroachment of the forest, and banned the wildlife exploitation. So there was a little the local village could reorganize their own legislation also around some of these principles, and those regulations were like the first of its kind in the region. And then we just kept on training farmers, because again you're building that local capacity. So now farmers have been trained on improving the quality of the oil, of doing farming contracts to guarantee sale and purchase. So there is also that support for better commercial practices. We helped them to improve the quality of the distillation equipment. So yeah, that's just one example that I think brings a lot of those principles together. And the really interesting bit is that at LUSH, I think a lot of people know that we also lend our windows and our shops and our online websites to campaigning groups. And we've done 3 campaigns with a local campaigning group called SOS Sumatra. Um, and the last campaign that we did was for them to actually secure a wildlife corridor in West Toba in northern Sumatra, where it's again to protect habitat of orangutans and other endangered megafauna, and then as well as support forest edge communities in order to have better access to land, better land practices, working with agroforestry, always this belief that you cannot do conservation without also supporting the local community and working with the local community, and even better if it's conservation led by the local community. So we also brought a lot of financial capital to the local projects in this blend between philanthropy, investment, and then off takers like Lush actually buying the raw material. So that idea, yeah, how do you do landscape development from a really holistic perspective?
Yeah, it's honestly so inspiring to hear that a project like that can actually lead to, regulations starting to encourage farmers to restore the land and protect the land. It just shows how much a project that started as a small initiative can affect the environment. There's one point I wanted to expand a bit more on here, which is you said that you focus on value adding to the local community, so you actually buy the oil instead of the raw material, which is the patchouli, right?
Yeah.
So is it more often for other cosmetics brands to actually purchase the raw material instead and to develop or process it themselves?
I think it depends. I think the people that usually do this are the distributors. So in a lot of cosmetics raw material supply chain, you have the farmers, or if it's like a wildly harvested material, you have farmers and people that are harvesting those materials in the wild, then sell everything into a distributor, probably without or a middle people. Some supply chains have just passed the material from hand to hand, and then that value gets added by a mid company, and then usually cosmetics companies will buy the vegetable oil or the essential oil from these distributors. Because we're working developing local projects, we are actually already buying the oil from the people that are there in the landscape working with the farmers or farming the oil.
Oh, I see. So I guess conventional supply chains are probably just a bit more broken, whereas there's another distributor probably somewhere else who will profit from developing the oil, whereas you're trying to really support the local community so that the money goes back to them.
Yeah, and other cases, like for example, we buy tonka beans. Like tonka beans are the fruit of a palm in the Amazon, and we buy directly from an indigenous project. And to transform tonka beans into tonka absolute is quite an elaborate process that involves, large distillation units. It's also it's not something that we can just place in the middle of the rainforest, where that indigenous community is. So in that case, we do buy the tonka beans and then we have them processed in France. But it's rare that we do this. It's really if the local, that capacity cannot be built locally. And in this case, like as an example, before, the way that we were getting tonka, there were 11 people in that supply chain. Like it passed through 11 hands, and now we're just buying directly from the actual indigenous led indigenous uh, you know community. And sorry, nonprofit. It's an indigenous led nonprofit. um, yeah, I think that's another example of when it's not possible to do the value addition locally.
Got it. So I know you would like to talk about another case study that's more towards the consumer side, which is the bring back the bring back scheme. Can you
Yeah,
tell me a bit more about that?
sure. And yeah, I can also share why necessarily I don't think this is a regenerative project and more a sustainable project if we're talking about the continuum. And then I can explain a little bit what are the regenerative aspects or how do we bring more regeneration into a project like this. So we, like many cosmetics company, we have to package our materials, even though it's worth saying that Lush actually invented naked cosmetics. I mean, of course, soap was invented a long time ago, but things like the shampoo bar or the bath bombs or toothy tabs for brushing your teeth, solid cosmetics were invented by Lush in the 90s or even some in the 80s. And about 60% of the products that we sell in the shops can be taken home with no packaging. But then there are all the creams and lotions and shower gels that we need to package. And since 2008, we've been using 100% recycled bottles and pots for, our packaging. Not 100% is 100% recycled, but we are way better than even like the most progressive cosmetics company out there. We're at nearly 70% recycled plastic across our whole ranges versus 10 or 20, of again, even the most progressive cosmetics companies. Um, but we wanted that material back because we're still putting that material into the waste stream. So again, we were early adopters of this idea of taking back packaging from customers. And that also evolved over time. So we started just taking the packaging back and then having to figure out how we were going to dispose it. And then we started, well, what if we put it back into our own packaging manufacturing? And then we moved to packaging manufacturers who were very close to our factory. So we shortened that supply chain. And then we started working with different plastic reprocessors that could wash and work that material so we could be back into packaging, until the point where we said, why don't we set up our own recycling center? So again, that regenerative aspect of increasing capacity in the local area. And that was partly because we couldn't have any traceability in what was happening to the materials that were so-called being collected as part of the recycling streams. As you know, Europe, over 50% of all the materials that are collected gets exported, and we don't know where they were being exported to. So we set up our own center to ensure traceability, like where, make sure that all the waste that we're producing in manufacturing and all the packaging that is being brought back by customers, we could ensure wouldn't end up on a beach in Malaysia. Um, and we started growing that closed loop scheme across all of our manufacturing markets. And we used a really interesting partnership. So trying to use very localized supply chains. We have our manufacturing, we have a packaging supplier that is usually quite close to our manufacturing unit, and then we found a local plastic processor that could support that triangle. And therefore, we set up closed loops in North America, in Japan, in Croatia, in the UK, just Australia that we use TerraCycle because we couldn't find a way to do a closed loop.
So you have recycling centers basically in every city where there is a Lush shop.
No, no, no. We have a partnership with a plastic reprocessor and a packaging manufacturing where we have manufacturing units, and we have manufacturing units in our biggest markets. So
Okay.
Lush always wanted to avoid, right? Let's manufacture in the Far East, or let's concentrate all manufacturing on one side. We actually distributed manufacturing to countries in like Japan or North America or Germany, Croatia,
Ah,
Australia,
okay,
UK.
okay.
And in the UK, we went a step further and actually set up our own recycling center. And now we've just moved to a bigger center so we can do more materials. Now we've also integrated closed loop water recycling. Uh, and then we're collecting the materials from the customers. It gets washed, it gets shredded, it gets turned into plastic pellets and returned into our own packaging. And then we're also using the Green Hub to minimize the use of single use plastics and the use of plastics in manufacturing in the UK, because then we can really wash containers and have a more reuse systems for example, crates and other containers, transit packaging that we use in manufacturing.
But it, so in my understanding, Lush, like even a Lush shop in Hong Kong will take back the
Yeah,
containers, right? And would
exactly.
they send it back to countries where there are recycling centers, like the UK, for you to recycle?
So I think Hong Kong, it actually gets processed locally. But for example, in Germany or in Europe, it all gets sent back to one of our two German hubs. In the
Okay,
UK, all the factories, they get returned into the green hub. From North America, they also get returned to our plastic reprocessors. So yeah,
okay,
we
so it
we try.
differs.
Yeah, it differs. So every country we had to find a different strategy. And we started also collecting more types of plastics. So now I think in 25 markets, all Lush plastics are collected through this scheme. And then we're trying to make sure that at least most of it gets processed back into packaging. So it's really a closed loop, and we're not like downcycling or turning into something that has less value, but rather turning it back into packaging again.
Okay, got it.
Very challenging in countries, yeah, very challenging in countries like Hong Kong or yeah, even Australia, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sure the traceability is very hard, but I think I always appreciate companies that really make an effort to make it closed loop. Um, so again, this is a very inspiring case study. And I also know there's another case study that you're very excited by called the Cork Pot, which is very carbon positive. So I'd love to hear a bit more about that too.
Yeah, and just to connect that back to packaging, so like the circular economy or recycling, we know that that's not necessarily the answer. It's just one of the few things that we can do right now to at least keep the value circulating. But regeneration is always to increase the capacity of the system. So like having the green hub that can educate and improve our local capacity to do the recycling, that's like a regenerative aspect of that project. But we also wanted to look into what can truly regenerative packaging look like. And then we developed a couple of super interesting projects. Like there is a project in Japan with the golden eagle habitat restoration and gift wrapping paper. We have regenerative cotton in India that is really working to transition farmers from conventional to regenerative agriculture. But my favorite is the cork pot in Portugal. And as we know, like cork oak forests is one of the traditional landscapes in Portugal. They have been producing cork for hundreds of years, but because of not deforestation, sorry, because of climate change and desertification, even the production of cork has become really expensive, and it's really at risk in Portugal. So we worked with local partners who were just incredible and who were already doing ecosystem restoration, and we thought, okay, what kind of product can we develop that is supporting ecosystem restoration and landscape regeneration in Portugal? And we were like, cork. So we developed a cork pot for our naked shampoo bars. And that cork pot is also just, it's not even processed cork, it's just cork that is cut and then using a very mechanical process to just turn it into the pot. So it's like a low intensive or not very processed material. And that is supporting forest restoration. And the cork, because you have the growth of the cork oak, and when the cork oak is growing, it's
Sorry,
absorbing and
what was it
drawing
called? Cork
cork,
coal?
cork oak,
Oh,
oak,
cork oak.
the
Okay,
tree,
okay, okay.
yeah.
Got it.
So the cork oaks, as they grow, they are drawing down carbon from the atmosphere, and that carbon gets transformed into biomass, so gets transformed into the cork. And the cork is just the skin of the trunk of the tree. And you take that every 9 years. So over the course of 9 years, that cork oak regenerates the skin on the trunk by again drawing down carbon and converting to biomass. So we did all the calculations of how much carbon is being sequestered, is like the technical term, how much carbon is being, absorbed by those trees and by that ecosystem. And we calculated that a small 33-gram pot made of cork is absorbing or has absorbed or has sequestered or draw down 1.3 kilos of 1.2 kilos of CO2 in its supply chain. So we are actually selling a product that is carbon negative, that actually mitigates climate change in the supply chain rather than contributes to climate change in the supply chain. And creating a marketplace for more carbon negative materials, I think, is a key part of our regenerative economy. We just need to be doing more and more and more of those materials that we can verify are really having a net positive impact on climate change and on biodiversity.
Mm. So how did you realize that cork oak is carbon negative? I mean, because there are many different types of wood. How is it that this specific type of wood is carbon negative?
All wood is sequestering carbon. The most important thing is that you store, so a wood table is actually sequestering and storing carbon. The key thing is making sure that there is permanence, so that carbon is going to be there for a long time, and that you can actually you're not creating a supply chain that is very for example, energy intensive. So those benefits are then taken away by trade-offs. So if you have a process that is using a large amount of electricity or fossil fuels, etc., you can undo some of those benefits. So how do we and
So do you
yeah,
mean that, like, say, a wooden table would still be sequestering carbon even as a table?
exactly. No. As a
Oh,
table, the carbon is locked.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
I've locked that carbon in the table. So as long as that table stays in my possession, that carbon is locked.
Mm,
Yeah.
I
And
see, I
then,
see.
but it's only carbon negative if the way I made the table, the way I transported the table. So let's say my table is made of mahogany from a process of deforestation of the Amazon, which I then transported by lorry out of the Amazon, and then, by ship, and then to Europe. And then I used uh, natural gas to power how I process the table. Probably the net positive is still going to be uh, uh, a carbon positive rather than a carbon negative outcome. Yeah.
Right, absolutely. Okay,
Yeah.
so I think this is a very inspiring last case study to end with, and I will actually link all of these case studies to the show notes so that any of our listeners who are interested to read more about it can then read more about it and be inspired, maybe to take initiatives like this for their own businesses. So I really want to thank you, Ruth, for sharing so many amazing case studies as well as lessons that you've learned through being part of Lush's team. And it is honestly, yeah, very inspiring. And I've learned a lot during this process too. So I hope this episode will give other businesses and listeners an insight into Lush's regenerative business model and give them ideas of how to then then transition their own business models. So thank you very much for today.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Again, with listeners, I will link all of the relevant case studies below. Thank you again for tuning in to this episode of Let's Talk Sustainable Business. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to our podcast series or explore the entire catalog of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting our website at www.conference-board.org. And if you have any thoughts to share with us, you can email us at sustainability@tcb.org. Thank you.
That was Let's Talk Sustainable Business.